Oh, we're live.
We are too. Right. Sorry, I missed the 10. I missed the countdown because I was listening for noise. All right, ladies and gentlemen, can you hear us in the audience? Do we have an audience? Make a noise if you're there. We don't know if you have an audience. We can't see you. Thank you for joining us this morning, or this evening, this afternoon, wherever you might be in the world, for our NunPub panel, which is titled "Online Conventions: A Possibly Premature Post-Mortem." So obviously the background for this panel is that we've had 2.5 years or more of COVID and lockdown, and that's caused a lot of pivoting to online. And it's changed some of how we've done conventions. And obviously we are not out of COVID yet, especially in the US. And online conventions may continue, but with over 2 years behind us, I thought it was a good time to look at what we've gained, what we've lost, who's done it well, who's done it poorly, and what we can learn. So just a quick introduction to our panelists. First of all, I'm Steve D. I'm a game designer and president of Tin Star Games. And you can find more about that on tinstargames.com or tinstargames.itch.io. And I'll just throw to our other panelists now. How do I make that advance?
Oh, no. Well, you figured that out, Beth. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Beth Rimmels. I am an RPG critic and columnist for EndWorld, and you can find all of my articles and reviews over there if you just search for B. Rimmels, Brimmels. I'm also a game designer, and my day job is content marketing manager, and I'm a former game store event coordinator. And you can also find me on Twitter, believe it or not, still at B. Rimmels. So.
Awesome.
I'm sorry, at Beth Rimmels. Duh.
Steve has an excuse. It's early for him.
I just haven't had enough caffeine today.
And I'm Avenel Wing. I am Senior Vice President of Double Exposure. So I run Dex Confirmation Metatopia, First Exposure Playtest Hall at Gen Con. And I am the Manager of Operations at the Center for Transformational Play at Carnegie Mellon. So lots of hats and lots of fingers and lots of pies.
I think everybody in the game industry has lots of hats. It's just the way it works.
Yeah. Yep. Steve, did you want me to move us into the next question while you fight with the tech?
It was just going to show our Twitter handles. So if you're looking for us, I don't know why it's not advancing the slide itself. It should be skipping through to all of our names, but I will work on that. Yeah, why don't you take us away with our first issues? I'll just say though that if there is people in the audience and you have questions, feedbacks, and thoughts about online conventions you've been to, then just put it in the comments and we'll look at it later in the session.
Yep, I am watching the Twitch chat. It'll pop up.
Oh, great.
Okay, so we wanted to start by kind of establishing, when we're talking about online conventions, what are we specifically talking about? What is an online convention? What does it do? What do we expect out of it? Beth, do you want to start with kind of your set of what makes an online convention?
I mean, that is in some ways such a broad question. Online convention is, well, okay. During lockdown, let's be honest, these were substituting as best we could under the circumstances to have some semblance of going out there with people. And we knew that we couldn't necessarily simulate everything. When we got into second year of this, people became much more demanding about what they wanted. So they were trying to actually replicate every single thing from an in-person convention online, and that doesn't really work. Yeah. At the minimum, though, online, for me, for an online convention, the panel should be online because that's usually one of the easiest things to replicate into a digital format. The play, it's great if you can do that. Depending upon the size and scale of the convention, that might not be feasible.
Steve, how about you?
Yeah, look, I think there's just good points there, that the panels are one of the easiest things to replicate. I think, as you say, it's also, people have tried to try to capture a lot of the ephemeral parts of conventions, because everyone's quickly realized that being in the same space physically is really important. And I think what I've seen, particularly in the last year, as you say, is as demand's gone up, people are going, oh, people are really, really missing that. And various attempts have been made to try to go, how do we recreate that? And generally, I don't think you can. At least nothing I've seen has done. And that's one of the reasons that prompted me to seeing some prompted me to run this panel, is seeing some conventions that tried to do this and did it really badly.
I would also add that the space outside of time element of being at a convention, where you set aside your daily life and you go to a place. And so it's the physical proximity and being co-mammals with people, but it's also the fact that you've drawn a line and the dishes aren't staring at you and you don't have to go reboot laundry and the kids don't need help with something. And it's much easier to step away and put that aside if you are physically not in the same space that your normal life happens in. And so I think that's a foundational issue with online conventions. As a convention organizer and as somebody that deals with infrastructure and hotel Wi-Fi and internet signals, I will say that online panels, if you are also trying to be in person, are not the easiest thing to replicate.
Oh yeah, no.
So I think that for me, online conventions can take the form of, let's all pile into a thing, whether it's Discord or Gather, and allocate out into places to go play. It can be knowledge sharing. It could be a series of Discord rooms where people get together and discuss a specific thing in a specific format. And so I think that, like you'd indicated, Beth, as we went from let's try to just get something that feels familiar and communal, as we started to move forward, people expected different things. When people have the option to be online, there's a lot of competition. I'm sorry, in person. There's a lot of competition for an online convention. Why spend all Saturday online at your desktop when in 2 weeks you're going to see everybody in person anyway?
Yeah, that's a really good point. It is very easy to be to look at it and just go, well, that's just not worth it. I'm not getting as much out of this. And one thing we were talking about just before we came on was talking about value for money. And when people have been looking at online conventions, that's just something that is that's come up. Why would I pay for something when I'm not really going to a place? I'm not really there. It's not giving me the same value. And of course, if you don't pay for something, then of course it's impossible to make it work well.
Yep.
But by the same token, of course, it takes bandwidth, it takes time, it takes people, it takes, staff and tech and everything else. So yes, I understand people being hesitant to pay, but by the same token, I also think that's a little more than a little unrealistic.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, ticket prices may not be the same because, you're not paying airfare and things like that. But to pay something just seems utterly reasonable to me.
So here's an interesting factoid. Our first Metatopia online 2020, we didn't charge anything. We had a bunch of sponsorship opportunities. We had a bunch of opportunities to be a friend of Metatopia and pay $15 towards pizza for the crew. We had 900 and some attendees from a dozen different countries. And the panel attendance numbers were incredibly high. We were averaging between 10 and 20 attendees for every online panel. And then our after views were outrageous too. For 2021, yes, 2021, we went to a $5 membership, $5, a $5 membership fee. and we made less money, and we had 200 attendees. We had a 700 person drop. I just want the audience to process those numbers. A $5 badge fee or attendance fee caused a 700 person drop in an online convention. I am just the tiniest bit bitter about the fact that being honest about the fact that it was taking us time, energy, and effort. It took us as many hours to run an online Metatopia as it does to prepare for an in-person Metatopia panel track. Including some repetitive stress recovery because I was working on a laptop instead of talking to people on the phone. And it was not supported by the community in the way that I had hoped that it would be, given the noise that people were making about the accessibility of online conventions.
Now, the tricky variable to that, though, is once November 2021 hit, you had the people already screaming, get back to normal. So how many people just ditched because of that? Even though we were far from normal and still are far from normal.
Yeah,
yes, absolutely.
And it is unfortunately part of human psychology that people will in larger numbers go to something that's free and then donate than they will if something has a cost. It's this weird part of our brain that will just put this shutter up and go, well, no, it's as soon as you put a price on it, I've changed my opinion of it, which is something that we have to work on. And yes, it leads to, we have this disconnect where people are demanding things, but not really willing to pay for it. And I think that's definitely a big challenge. Have you guys been to any other conventions that have dealt with that issue, that have charged or not charged? I've seen that sliding scale as well, where the digital version was cheaper, which I think seems to work, but it also kind of increases the idea that you're getting less, of course.
I mean, you're not getting all of the ephemeral benefits. Gen Con Online did a really good job with initially with their Discord and their signposting, and there was some thought to the experience design. On the other side, you had Origins Online, just talking about the biggest, right, most visible experiences. Yep. Origins Online didn't even have a method last year for their GMs to connect with their players, and a solution was sorted out like the night before. And I think some of that's a sign of the fact that people are realizing that they are not getting the social justice, social equity cookies that they were expecting for continuing to do more accessible online things.
Yeah, absolutely. We will talk about equity in a moment. I just want to talk a little bit about Discord, because I think a lot of people have approached this problem as a technical problem, as a technological problem, I should say. And I think one thing we've discovered is that Discord has a lot of problems. It creates, you either end up with a central room that's incredibly crowded and hard to track, and people have then tried to fix that with lots and lots of breakout rooms, which then become impossible to navigate. Have you guys, what are your thoughts on Discord? Is there better tech? Is there something else we could be using?
So I use Discord all the time, both for my day job and for my private games. And then I run a playtest server on Discord for another person. So I use Discord all the time. And in general, I like Discord. I think it works, particularly if you're doing things Theater of the Mind or things that are more small group and everything else. However, for the attempt to do a event that is normally associated with Gen Con, it's not a Gen Con event per se, but it happens at the same time as Gen Con. So in 2020, they moved everything online, as necessary, because of peak COVID and everything else. And one of the things they decided to do was to make a Discord server so people could chat just like they do at the social event that this was replicating.
Right.
And the sound of everyone showing up at the same time, the pings triggered some anxiety in so many people, because you just said nonstop.
Yes.
And you couldn't mute it fast enough, And so that definitely showed the drawback of Discord with large groups. And it was a great idea, of then, you can try to then move into small things. But just that influx of about, 200 plus, maybe even 300 people all coming into one chat server at the exact same time was just overwhelming.
Yeah. I saw an interesting use of Gather. I don't know.
Yep.
So Gather is a visual interface where you kind of walk around a space and you've got a little avatar. And as you get closer to other people, they fade in and you can see their camera feed if cameras are turned on. And I helped with the tech support of an event, a college fair. Basically, I helped out a friend of a friend recently.
Yep.
And it was fascinating to see how smooth and effective and absolutely dry and boring this format was. It did exactly what it was supposed to. People would show up, find their conversations, but it was tightly scheduled and orchestrated. Everybody knew that they were logging into this place, they were looking for this person, and they were going off to this private room. They had familiarity with the tech. And so there wasn't a huge learning curve. There was some, oh God, I can't find my professor. Where are they? What do I do? And a few things we were like, oh, there needs to be better signage. There needs to be better communication. But if you show up and you don't find your person, here's the places they could be. And it was the thing that felt the most like wandering around a convention, trying to shepherd people into the places that they belong at the beginning of the hour.
Yep.
And it was interesting for me because the thing it demonstrated was that online conventions require the same thoughtful, considered, what are we trying to do? How are we communicating it to people? What do you get in advance? What do you need? What information needs to be communicated on site as designing a physical convention? And the conventions that I've seen, and we in 2020 and early 2021 through Envoy, we supported every convention that was doing gaming online, right? We, instead of having game masters on site at conventions, we were supporting everybody in their online convention. The ones that were most successful are the ones that thought about the experience design.
Yeah.
User experiences is everything online. Interesting what you mentioned about Gather, because I actually attended a press junket through Gather in, was it 2020 or 2021? And they clearly did not give as much thought to this. The one good thing that they did do was they had lots of staff to try to get people to the right places. But we had no heads up in advance as to how the tech worked. We were very much floundering. And if you had anybody with a visual disability trying to figure out how to do what on Gather was very frustrating.
Oh, yeah. Well, and that is an added layer of complication, because doing online events means that you can do the closed captioning, and there are some things that are huge benefits, but somebody with a tech barrier is just out.
Well, a tech barrier, even the icon, you're trying to grab the icon to like meet with the person so they can take you to the room, but you click the wrong thing and then you can't seem to get out of it because you can't tell the little tiny icons.
Yeah. So I went to a convention in Boston with Gather, but there was some problem with the bandwidth, and I was also in a place with a really poor internet connection. And the way that GatherTown works, where if you come close to someone, you automatically get their video cam and their text. It actually became that people were avoiding people because they didn't want to have their bandwidth sucked down. So they'd come towards you and go, "Oh no, I didn't mean to get that close. I didn't want to talk to you. I just was looking at you." And so it was actually failing to do the thing of getting people to bump into each other because the tech just was not really working to support that. And it seemed like a way of trying to brute force wandering around a convention for chat, when actually we should have just translated it as opposed to trying to copy it, and that, to something like a chat room. I have seen other things work a little bit better where it's more like instances in an MMO. So you can be in this room or that room or that room, and your character will walk there. But when you're in there, you can talk to everyone in that room, like a chat room. So that's sort of, I think, a half and half idea. But yeah, I was very frustrated by how poorly Gather was working at that time. I think I think that was also, though, they were trying to get people to walk around and browse people's games and stations, as opposed to everyone go here, everyone go there, and it doesn't really work for browsing. That is another issue, of course, that you can't. The internet, tech is very much directing people. We've talked about that, getting people to where they want to go and having signposts. What you can't seem to do, unless you guys have any thoughts about the idea of discovery and surprise that you get at a convention, where you're walking around going from A to B and you see C and D that you've never even thought of. Is there any, have you guys experienced anything that helped with that?
Not really. And like I can like brainstorm stuff, but the tech requirements for it, we're just not ready for at the moment. That's the problem.
That might go down in.
Go ahead, Steve.
I was going to say, this might be one of the things that is just really hard to do, and I think that's worth making a list of. What can we not do, and possibly not for a very long time technologically, because we have to be honest about what we're losing when we go online.
Right. So Smirk and Dagger really leaned into the Gen Con online vendors room concept in it might have been 2020, and then again in 2021. And I deal with a lot of publishers, and a lot of them sort of dabbled in setting up these little virtual booths where you would go and click on a map and it would load up a little mini web page that gave you the experience of a booth, sort of.
Mm-hmm.
And Kurt really leaned hard into it and had massive benefit because other people were just floundering and just hadn't gotten their footing in it. Mm-hmm. And so people would show up in the Smirk and Dagger booth and he'd be like, here's all the places that you can click on to go play my games right now. Or you can go watch a demo over here. Here's a link. And he treated it almost like a virtual, more like a community day booth, where there was like a greeter and a person that was just like, and let me just show you the knives that we've got today, and the this and the that, and here's all the things that you can get out of this. And it took a very specific, very enthusiastic, very all-in mindset that I think that people who are trying to overcome tech fear and their own grief over the fact that we're not in person, there were a lot of layers that made it more complicated for other people to succeed. The other thing that occurs to me is that I went into the Gen Con Discord and was like, oh, I know exactly what this feels like. This feels like the Eternal September, which is a reference to when all of a sudden AOL sent out all the CD, or at the time it was little floppies, and invited the world to come and join online. And people who'd already been on AOL had cultures and had routines, and there were behaviors, standards that had been set. And all of a sudden people flooded in, and chat rooms that had some structure and had some rules and some guidelines got completely flooded. And I don't think anyone was prepared for the effect of grandma showing up to play on Gen Con online. And the community overwhelm of people like Beth and I that live in Discord and live online and do these things day in and day out. And then all of a sudden there's the person shouting into the chat room that's like, I can't find anything. What do I do? And I was like, oh my God, this is like 30 years later, but feels so familiar. And I almost feel like we would have had better success if we'd rolled back in time and set up a bunch of chat rooms and been like, okay, so we're going to like, here's the lobby. And here's the place that you find the list of things you can go look at, because we made that work in the 90s. We could make it work again. And trying to get so fancy as the Gathers, where you have to have a laptop that can handle it and you have to have a camera. And if you don't have your camera on, you're the weird one. Maybe if we rolled back and just been like, we're going to set up a bunch of chat rooms and people are welcome to be brand advocates in these chat rooms. Go play, kids. We might have had better luck.
Yep.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a really good point, that we often try to find the most technologically advanced solution instead of the best solution, which is often, scrolling back. And Discord has that thing where it sort of will force you into one channel when you first log in, but it's not as good as a lobby. It doesn't really work as a lobby.
And it doesn't have the mindset.
Yep.
Beth, you were saying, sorry.
I was going to say, no, and to be fair, because, I will play the other side of this, which is I also have a great deal of sympathy for all the conventions, particularly the early conventions that were trying to dive into this field, when all of a sudden lockdown happened in March. And, they have a convention that they've taken a year to plan. And now all of a sudden in 2 months, they have to switch it to online.
Yeah.
So we had a lot of challenges. Unfortunately, what I haven't necessarily seen since then is a willingness to improve and build upon, even if, as you're saying, technically maybe we roll back to this chat room model or something. But instead, it seems like there's been this rush to, well, we don't need that anymore.
Yes.
And really, we don't?
Yeah, I mean that's something I'm really wanted to explore as well in this panel is what have we gained and how do we keep those things? So we mentioned equity before. I think that's a huge deal. I know, Beth, you wanted to speak about how online conventions could improve things for disabled people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, definitely the full transparency. So I don't drive at night or highways anymore for reasons I'm not going to go into. But that completely limited my real life gaming life. I went from, going anywhere for a game any hour of the day or night, when I felt like it, to now I have to be careful about things. Yeah, well, this is all pre-COVID, and plan things out or have a ride or everything else. So COVID's horrible, not going to negate that at all. But I have been gaming more since COVID happened because it leveled the playing field.
Yep.
Because all those in-person games moved online, and most have, at least in my experience, in my personal life, have stayed there for various reasons. Sometimes it's that some of the players have moved other places, so now, the group cannot get together in person. So, okay, we're just going to stay online or whatever. But I'm not the only person with some sort of issue that felt that in the moving to online, it was a great leveling. You didn't have to worry about getting rides or accessibility, or your adaptive devices that you can use with your computer work even better. Whereas in convention, maybe you're having problems with your hearing aids because there is so much background noise, but you can control that better when you're doing this on Discord or in some other, electronic alternative. So horrible experience, COVID, do not recommend. But there have been a few things that have been beneficial to a percentage of the population. And so again, with everybody we don't need that stuff anymore. Now they're grieving a loss because they were able to feel like they fit in with everybody again.
Yep.
For me, the biggest issue has always been that I live in Australia. So as I mentioned early on, it's 8:30 a.m. here. But simply the cost of flights, the cost of physically getting to Europe and the US is extremely prohibitive from Australia. It's always been a huge factor in our industry. We're a small country where we have something like 5% of America's population, 6%. We're spread out across a massive continent. We have all these challenges, and we really know the industries in Europe, in the US, and America. And I was able to go to Unpub. I was able to go to Metatopia for the first time in my life. So that was an immensely leveling effect. Time zones were still an issue sometimes, but I was actually able to log on and go, and someone said, "Oh, finally you're coming to the Metatopia. It's going to be great to see you there." And that's something I'm really hoping continues because it's a really important access issue. And I think it's really a way that we can level that playing field. And it can also be, we talked about costs being important, but it can be cheaper. Even if you're paying for the convention, you're not paying for a hotel, you're not paying for petrol, you're not paying for all the other expenses, food on site, which can be, some of the most expensive things as part of it. So that's definitely a huge access issue for me. As I say, the one thing that we couldn't fix is time zones. So sometimes I'm now looking at conventions and going, well, this convention is all online, which is great, but it goes from my midnight to my 8 a.m. And that's not going to help me. And that's an interesting issue about access as well, because there's not a lot of point extending beyond those hours. Metatopia, I think, did a good job of going, we're going to have up late to try to get more people across the world and have a breakfast session, again, for the same issue. And I think that was a good example of trying to realize, again, that you have this audience that's across the world.
Well, and Metatopia did something else good, which not every convention has done, that even went online, which was, at least for panels, the panels then went up to YouTube afterwards.
Yep.
So, okay, your time zone does not work for this at all. You cannot attend live, but you at least still get the benefits of being able to watch the panel. And it kind of amazed me as to how many conventions that did go online, but you had to be there live.
Yeah.
There was no recording, or they
Let
did
me
not
just
post the
tell you
recording.
about the emotional and actual practical work burden involved in that. It took the team a full 2 weeks of work after the fact to get the Metatopia panels up afterwards. It was a gigantic pain in the ass.
Oh, I'm sure it was an immense load of work. And you know what? If you said it took 2 months, I still think that would have been reasonable, to do.
Right.
But these other places, just from the beginning of their planning, had no plans to do such a thing.
And I don't think it's fair to demand that they do it. I think that we can encourage, just having done it from the inside and living in a space where people are regularly making demands of what I should do and what I must do in order to be equitable or in order to be accessible. I'm really careful about saying that we should. But I think that being very clear about what your intentions are, being very clear about what you can or can't do. We didn't run a 2022 Metatopia because in the car on the way home from Gen Con, we looked at each other and said, we just don't have it this year, right? Trying to exist in a oh my God, why are all my words gone today? I know why. Trying to exist in both worlds at once, right? The fact that professionally we have to be on site at conventions in order to continue to pay the mortgage.
Right.
And trying to exist in this hybrid is the word I was looking for. Situation where we're still online too. We were like, okay, we can try to figure out something else and we can like look at what online Metatopia actually does and figure out how to replicate it. But we're not doing the big 3-day 100 panel. Physically, we don't have it.
And it's hard, particularly depending upon the scale of the convention. I mean, you know me, I love Metatopia, but your top attendance is what, maybe 1,000 people because it's very targeted.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yes.
So again, that is going to be difficult to switch over. The one that does, and again, I have sympathy, but I'm also a bit annoyed. Was I had a conversation with someone who's on the board for San Diego Comic-Con. So gigantic scale, quite the opposite side of Metatopia.
Right.
And, made a comment about, have you guys considered doing something, even if it's delayed access, that you can't necessarily stream it live or whatever, but, doing something along the, to continue it for people who want to be there. And two interesting things. So one is they said they can't afford it, which on one hand, yes, I can understand because they are a private organization. But on the flip side, they could get sponsorships. I mean, let's face it, this is San Diego Comic-Con. They could get sponsorships to cover the costs. But the other flip side there, and this was not said, but it was definitely an undercurrent to the conversation, is that, well, the exclusivity of being there is part of the thing.
Yeah.
Boo. Boo.
Boo.
Yeah.
Boo. They like the people, waiting to get into Hall H, which, I understand. I've been there. I've been to San Diego Comic-Con pre-COVID, and all that stuff. I loved it. But, they like that, there are trailers there that you see that don't drop for months, and things like that. And so, any kind of equity? No.
Well,
See, and I don't have sympathy for that. That is a choice. And Metatopia is planning on doing so let me back up. Trying to broadcast from a hotel.
Oh, no, terrible. It's horrible.
Is a nightmare. Especially because we run 3 tracks simultaneously. Having 3 rooms with 3 technicians reliant on hotel Wi-Fi to get a broadcast out to the world causes palpitations. It also, because we would be on a day-night cycle of East Coast US, would narrow us down, and getting people zoomed in to participate hybrid, like we've really chewed this over, and we're going to do a hybrid creature where the weekend before is Friday, Saturday panels, possibly with an overnight component so that we loop all the way around. Noon Friday to noon Saturday, so that we can bring as many people in from as many places around the world as possible. And then the next weekend is going to be the in-person, where we do the same thing we've always done. We capture the recordings and we turn them over to Jason Pitt with Genesis of Legends, and he does his magic, and it goes up online sometimes a year later, right? So that we are continuing the ethos of Metatopia's knowledge sharing and capture, because a lot Darren Watts, our my partner in the Metatopia panel track, we lost him this month. So hold on.
Yeah, this is still raw for us, so
It is.
Please bear with.
Part of his principle was that we capture this stuff so that people aren't constantly reinventing the wheel.
Yep.
And so that gives us a leg up on the archive and share later, because we were already invested in that, and it was already a guiding principle from the beginning. It's interesting that the San Diego Comic-Con panels had the opposite deliberate intention, which was be as secretive as possible and keep it behind cloaks and shields and don't share it. And that's never going to be our ethos. And so the idea that the decision could be made to be less accessible in order to be glitzier, I don't get it.
Yeah, and it's so weird because everybody I've met over there is wonderful, but there is this mindset of, well, we're going to have the information drops that are going to make News and Entertainment Weekly and Variety and Hollywood Reporter, And it's like, well, yeah, but you know what? You can still do that and record these panels and put them up online a month or two later.
Yeah.
You can get the best of both and still serve people who can't be there.
Absolutely. We've talked a lot, though, like the difference between those conventions is very much a kind of philosophy, but I think it's possible from a marketing point of view, from the customer's point of view. Conventions have a sort of habit of going, we're everything for everyone. We have everything you could possibly want. And that means the customer comes in and goes, well, I expect exclusives, I expect panels, I expect everything, and I want them all online. And do you think that that's something we should address by having more statements of this is what our convention is about? Because I think it would be illustrative. Obviously, though, there is a cost, because companies don't want to be too transparent, because they risk, I guess, revealing that they aren't covering one thing or another, and they might lose customers. So I can see why there's hesitance to do that. But I think that's an example of something that we can do better, of going, why do we have panels at our convention? It's not just because everyone does. We have a philosophy, and Metatopia is actually a great example of trying to go, this is what we're about. Do you guys have any thoughts about, could we do that better? Signposting intent of conventions and purpose.
It's funny. It amazes, because I've also known a lot of people who've tried to start small conventions, and then I've also seen conventions lose their way.
Conventions can definitely be killed by trying to be everything.
Well, or I was going to say, just plain lack of thought. I was going to say, my real point is, I am constantly amazed at how many try to start a convention with no more thought than, hey, this would be fun. Let's get a bunch of people together. And there really is no philosophy, no plan. And it just kind of throwing spaghetti against the wall.
Yeah. I think also these days, with the massive growth of geek and culture and things, is that people go, well, there's money here, so we should make it.
Yep. It's interesting because the place that I've seen, and this is a Comic-Con Gen Con Origins side effect, is I've had more conversations in the last 18 months with small conventions existing already or upcoming who have decided that they're going to make their money off of that they're going to pay for the entire venture off of charging exhibitors to be in their vendor hall, and that they want me to advocate. So Envoy represents and is a marketing consultancy for 70 board game publishers. And so we run street teams and we do consultation on how to get your message out and how to brand build and do all the things you need to do in order to build a company and build a brand. And these conventions, right, they write to a publisher and say, give us free stuff. And the publisher says, go convince Avi. Go talk to Avi. And so then I get on a Zoom call with them and we have a conversation where I'm like, okay, so what's your plan? Talk to me about what you're doing. I've been running DexCons since 97. Talk to me. Let me help you. Pick my brain. And they're like, what we're going to do is we want you to convince your publishers to come out to our convention and pay us money. And we're going to use that money to pay for the convention. First of all, the numbers that they're throwing around indicate they don't know what they're doing negotiating venue space. Publishers can't fit an extra convention a month into their schedule. I talked to every single one of my publishers at the end of the year and I said, I told people we would ask, this is what they're proposing. And the answer was, I can't do that, especially not during COVID. And so do I think that each convention should have a strong brand, should know what it's about, should know what it's good at, and try not to serve everybody? Absolutely. And it shouldn't try to do the things that the mega cons do because people are not going to show up. In 2019, I was either running a convention, prepping a convention, or traveling to somebody else's convention 27 weekends of that year. So I've attended a ton of regional conventions, and there are maybe 4 where a publisher has any chance of making their money back in the exhibit hall. So conventions, pick what you're going to do. Pick something that isn't be a buying, because you're not an expo. You're never going to be an expo. And build a strong brand around the thing that you are capable of doing that other conventions aren't doing. Absolutely. Figure out, if you're doing panels, why. Don't just let anybody have the stage. Figure out why and what your audience gets out of them. There's nothing more disheartening than to be invited by a convention to participate in a panel, show up and realize that the audience has no interest in that topic whatsoever, and the room is absolutely empty. Don't do that to your speakers. Don't do that to your space. It's a waste of space. Don't do that to your audience. Pick a brand and stick with it.
Yeah. So, but from that topic, I guess, we talked about the difficulty of being online. We talked about trying to do what you're good at. I can see a lot of conventions, especially the small ones, going, we can't offer online. But so how do we reconcile that? I guess by doing smaller versions online, doing some compromise.
I mean, it's a question. It's a question of what their resources are. I mean, and small can vary widely. I mean, I've seen conventions as small as 4 little hotel banquet rooms, and they had very small margins to cover. To small convention being a few thousand. So and it's a question, like I said, of what their resources are. I mean, obviously, I'm an advocate for try to be accessible, but you also got to do what you can do. And you're better off planning and maybe adding that layer than biting off more than you can chew.
Yep.
I also think there's some decisions by the community, right? The Metatopia community is bought into the idea that having the international audience involved in what we're doing really matters. We saw such a diversity of perspective, and we all became better at our craft in 2020 because we brought people into the conversation that we'd never had access to. We were able to ask them questions. We were able to learn from them. And so the Metatopia community went, oh, we get it. And so if I turn around and say, we're really invested in this idea, everyone's going to say, yes, we are. And I'm going to say, here are the trade-offs that I'm facing. which of these things do we collectively prioritize, and how do we lean into the things that really matter here? Being accessible for people that don't speak English means that I have to pay for a translator, which means I'm not going to be able to do this other thing. Are there other ways that collectively we can tackle that? Is right. Jason Pitt translated the French game design panel himself and did the subtitles for us because he said, this matters to me, and you paying for a translator and for the captioning doesn't make sense. I can do this, and that frees up these resources over here. The smaller the convention, the more likely that people are contributing time in exchange for ephemeral benefits anyway. Right. So as a community, there has to be this conversation that says we value these things, and then how do we make it happen?
Right.
Yes, I think that's really what's coming out of this, is that conventions have to work with their audience, understand their audience, and talk to their audience, and increase transparency about what they can and cannot do, and get a sense of the community understanding the size and the scope of what resources they have, because I think that's very invisible. We have a quick comment from Dino Corgi, who said that they learned at Metatopia that potatoes are not a staple food for everyone. Someone else, has said, I learned, fragility of the electricity grid in Manila. Yes, again, we learn a lot about international issues and conditions and stuff. And there was the Southeast Asia Con last year. I didn't get to it, but it had a very strong online presence, I heard. Was speaking of things that do things right, which was allowed people all over Southeast Asia to sort of connect and get things on. So with, I don't want to say COVID reducing, because we don't know what's going on with COVID. Let's just.
I was going to say, I think if you look at the articles about the Davos World Economic Forum, we know that COVID definitely isn't over. Davos, where all the billionaires were, had extreme COVID precautions. So this isn't over yet, people. It's not.
Yeah. Do you think we're gonna? Well, there's obviously a huge push, I think, for conventions to get back in person, because I think they make more money, and people seem to really value that.
And people miss people. I mean, that's also part of it.
Yeah, absolutely. People want to go, and so what do you think is going to be the future? What's the next year or two? But also then, how do we keep online conventions going forward? Are we going to see? Well, Gen Con's just recently announced, I believe, that there's no masking and no vaccine requirements. Yes, so.
Which they announced after people put down money, which is not a good look.
You have to put down. You have to buy your tickets
after you paid for your vendor booths and everything else.
Right after, yeah. So that's a good example of lack of transparency. People need to know early what's going on, what the conditions are. Absolutely.
So one of the things that we've seen recently is that online play conventions, where people show up in a chat room, a Discord, or wherever, and find someone to play a game with, have not been hitting critical mass. So they will have a bunch of people show up in the room. Some people will find games, some people won't. It has slowed down. It's dependent on time of year, right? Trying to do it in the spring when the weather's suddenly gotten nice is absolutely a guarantee it's going to fail. Right. And so I think that what we're going to start seeing is more of the Metatopia-ish model, where people are figuring out how to have some content online, but the fully virtual events are only going to happen, knock on wood that this doesn't happen, if we have another surge that pushes people back into lockdown, or some other virus comes up and knocks our feet out from under us. I think that the heyday of entirely online gaming conventions that replicate in any way the full experience of panels and go play this thing and hang out in a chat room, that was a very short-lived flash in the pan, in my estimation.
So given that, if we are having hybrids, are we in danger of sort of dividing the convention up? Because if I'm in the city, I'm generally, from my experience, less likely to be in the online space. So are we going to have like a Gen Con where 90% of the people are people who are in, Milwaukee or whatever, in that space, and then the online space becomes this weird non-Gen Con like ghetto experience where it's everyone who can't get there. How do we avoid that?
So I think you would have to look at, excuse me, differently. I'm not sure if you remember, but there was a time before Gen Con moved to Indianapolis where they had, main Gen Con in the summer. But then there was an experiment with doing a smaller Gen Con in the winter, which I forget exactly what was called. And obviously, even they knew, yes, this is going to be smaller because a lot of people are not going to go to Milwaukee in the winter.
Mm-hmm.
The city has tunnels for a reason between its hotels. But I think that, if you are an organization of a certain size, it might not be an awful idea to maybe think about experimenting with something in the off season. That would be the digital component instead of trying to do both at the exact same time with all the pitfalls that we already mentioned. Maybe experiment with something for, January or something like that. And see if that gets any kind of traction. That would be one way to move forward, trying to serve both communities.
And I think we're seeing that with Unpub and Nunpub, that they basically split. So we're having Nunpub now. The regular Unpub is in March, so that way they can divide their attention without dividing their focus. So that seems like, I think, a good suggestion. But I think a convention though might be worried about having no online presence these days, and be criticized for that. So I guess the question is, how do you have a sort of nominal online experience without trying to recreate everything?
But again, it's about the transparency. If
Yep.
you're saying that, listen, for these reasons, it's very difficult to do it, at the same time. Or we can do something at the same time, but there's going to be conditions. Like we will record panels, but you're not going to see them for 2 months, because we have to process them and edit them and everything else. Because the bandwidth at the hotel is just too terrible for us to live stream, from the hotel or something along those lines. I think people would respond to that much better than, oh, well, we're just going to do this, or we're not going to do anything. If you're transparent, I think you're going to get a bit more buy-in.
Well, and I also, so think about it. Gen Con at its height was what, 60,000 attendees? Multiply that by $5 extra per badge, right? So all of a sudden we're talking a nest egg that could turn around and be used to pay salaries for 2 people, a living wage salary for 2 people to be responsible for developing and executing an online version or an online supplement, even if it was a supplement and was billed that way. And so once you get up to a certain scale, a PAX Unplugged, a Comic-Con, a Gen Con, maybe an Origins, right? It might have to be a $10 addition to every badge sale, and that becomes an accessibility issue all its own. But the bigger conventions could conceivably create a revenue model that was sponsorship and a modest increase to badge price with a public statement that says you have the opportunity to pay again this additional fee to contribute to the accessibility of this content online. And so if I were problem solving this for a big convention, that's the direction I would go. I would say, look, here are the things that we want to do, and run it like a freaking Kickstarter, right? With stretch goals that says, this is the baseline of what we're going to provide. We're going to hire 2 people who are going to do this as their job. They're going to get paid a living wage for the city we're based in. If they happen to work remotely and live in the middle of the country, well, they're going to be fat and happy and it'll be great for everybody. And then if enough community members buy into this extra pot, we bring on a 3rd person whose entire responsibility is X, Y, and Z.
Right.
And so I feel like there's not the social or pragmatic incentive to take that on and do that, but I would love for that to change.
Right. And the model that you just described, absolutely. Plus, if you're talking the really big conventions, again, they can also supplement those costs by looking for sponsors for it. That if it, because really, who's going to care in today's world if before whatever video or something it says, sponsored by Warner Brothers, see our latest movie, or something like that.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that's a really good way to think. I think what we're coming back to is just being aware and thinking ahead, and transparency has come up over and over again. Talking to your community, being very clear about what you can and can't do. We had a great comment from BGG Sarah, who was saying that she's a small community con and they were able to do things in the local fairgrounds, which allows them to have no enclosed spaces or places that are very open. And that's a great example of using your strengths. We can say, hey, we've got an open air space. That means, you might feel safer about COVID. And I can see, we come back in again and again to understanding your size, understanding your resources, and doing as much as you can with those things. We've got a couple of minutes left.
Intention.
Oh, sorry?
And having clear intention.
Clear intentions, yes. Yeah, clear intentions that are well communicated. Fantastic. We've got a couple of minutes left. Do you guys have anything else you want to say, summarize? Views for the future, hopes for the future?
I mean, my hope for the future is that we don't entirely leave behind, like I said, the people, whether it's disability, it's location in the world, or whatever. Yes, it takes time. It takes extra thinking. It's more complicated. And we may not be able to get easily to what we want to do to include those people. But we'll never get there if they're not part of the conversation and a part of the thought process.
Right.
Fantastic. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, and we're gamers. We can freaking design this, right? Iterate it, test it, watch the wheels fall off at the game table and go, well, that didn't work.
Yep.
It's heartbreaking when it happens, but we're pre-hardened to having a playtest fail. So let's playtest some things.
Yep.
It's a really good way to put it. Yeah, let's experiment and be honest when we fail and say we're going to try to do better. And hopefully the communities will back us in those things.
Communities have to be loving, gentle, and supportive, even when the wheels fall off. And being honest that the wheels fell off and we're not sure what happened is part of that process. And having communities say, well, that's okay, let's regroup and try again, is an important part of that.
That's a really good point. And I think that actually might give me an idea for another panel, because I think increasingly audiences are very harsh and very unforgiving. And I think there are certain parts of the industry that encourages and builds that kind of audience. So I'd love to have a talk in the future about how do we build better kind of communities who understand these kind of things. I really want to thank you guys for coming today. This was a panel that I put together because I had more questions than answers, and you guys have been amazing at giving us your insights. Thank you for everyone who was watching and putting in the comments. And you can we'll go just our details again. You can find me again at Tinstar Games with a 1 at the end on Twitter. And Avenel's putting her Twitter stuff in the comments as well. And I'll throw mine in there too, if I can figure out how. And Beth is at Beth Rimmels, I believe, on Twitter.
Yes, on Twitter. Yes.
We'd love to continue the conversation. So please post your comments there, post your thoughts. And I believe this is going online eventually as well. This will be up on YouTube at some later date. So we'll be able to put it out there. All right. Thanks very much, guys. We'll sign it off there. Thanks again. And enjoy the rest of your convention.